Good evening. So perhaps I'll say it twice. So good evening. Um, Good evening and welcome. My name's Rudra Chaudhary. I work at Carnegie, India. Could I please express my deep gratitude for all of you spending your time this evening with us. This discussion couldn't be, I think, timed at a better moment in international politics. There are a range of arguments now with regards to the effects of the Ukraine crisis, geopolitically, on technology, on the economy, on geoeconomics, but also on the future of the Indo-Pacific. And we've got an absolutely fantastic panel of speakers to talk about exactly what these effects might be and how they might be deconstructed, especially from the Indian perspective. This discussion is being held on the back of something called the Security Studies Dialogue. The first iteration of it was hosted today by Carnegie India and with the support of a number of think tanks and universities from across India. And we're very grateful for those who are here in the room, not only those who were represented at the dialogue, but also many of you who've taken this evening to spend with us. Could I please introduce for you Shibani Mehta, the Senior Research Analyst at Carnegie India. Shibani's also been the point person on the Security Studies Dialogue. She'll be moderating this evening's discussion and will introduce our very special panel. Shibani.
Thank you, Rudy. Hello and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this Wednesday, rainy weekday. Through this panel discussion, we want to explore how the deepening Russia-China ties will change for the Indo-Pacific, how the war in Ukraine will impact alliances and partnerships in the region, and how the conflict will influence India's strategic priorities and its global aspirations. I'd like to introduce the panel today. Joining me are C. Raja Mohan, Senior Fellow with the Asia Society Policy Institute in Delhi, a division of the Asia Society India Center in Mumbai. He's also a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and was the founding director of Carnegie India in 2016. Mr. Vijay Gokhale is a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie India. Mr. Gokhale retired from the Indian Foreign Service in January 2020 after a diplomatic career of nearly 4 decades. He has served as ambassador to Germany and China and was also the former Foreign Secretary of India. Ashley Townshend is Senior Fellow for the Indo-Pacific Security at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's also the founding co-chair of the annual US-Australia Indo-Pacific Deterrence Dialogue and a non-resident senior fellow at the United States Study Center, University of Sydney. Indrani Bagchi, she's the CEO of Ananta Aspen Center here in Delhi. She was previously, as we all know, the diplomatic editor for Times of India, where she reported on and analyzed foreign policy and national security issues. With that, could I please invite all of you to join me on stage? Yeah. Right. I think we should get straight to the questions. I know that the audience will also have a lot of questions for this audience, for this panel. I'm going to begin with the question that is being hotly debated currently. And I'd come to Raja sir first because you have to leave a little bit early. There was an argument that Washington was capable of deep commitments to both Europe as well as the Indo-Pacific. But the Ukraine conflict brings both two rivals to two power rivals for the US to the forefront. So what is your opinion on whether the US's focus on the Indo-Pacific is diluting or being distracted?
Thanks. So let me begin by thanking Carnegie India and Rudro for inviting me. Like all good Asians, I had to give an apology before I speak further. Unfortunately, I had to leave just before 8, so I really love to stay here and enjoy this evening, but unfortunately I had to leave, so I'm really sorry for that. So let me apologize in advance. So to your question, can the US walk in Europe and chew gum in Asia? Now, I think it's a good question. But if you look at it in a post-war historic perspective, the core US security commitments after the Second World War for Central Europe and Northeast Asia, those commitments have not really changed. So if he's talking about American staying power, those alliances have held. Some of them become stronger, some of them might have become weaker. So it is the US can operate in both the theaters. Today, of course, it's not just Northeast Asia. The theater has expanded. So that's first part. Second is, having seen 6 months of the Ukraine war, Russia doesn't look as powerful as it did on February 23rd. That the Russian capacity to fundamentally threaten Europe through military means has been tested and found wanting. And I could be wrong on this. So the idea that a Russian thrust in Europe would prevent the Americans from doing things in China. And I think we've seen, in fact, today, people like Germany and all who committed to spend a lot of money. I don't know if they say, now say, look, Russia is not a threat. Why should I waste my money? So I think it's a moving debate, so I think we should pay attention to it. Third, the Russia-China alliance. Again, if you look at the last 80 years, there's been a continuous shift in the nature of the relationship between US, China, and Russia. If you go back to the 50s, one of the first things Mao Zedong did was to sign a treaty of alliance with Stalin. So it's not that they've not been allies before. They've been allies, they've been enemies. So my sense is what happens in Ukraine will begin to affect this triangular relationship, irrespective of what was said on February 4th when Putin went to Beijing. So my sense is we've seen these changes. America and China were friends, they were enemies, they're friends again, now they're enemies again. US and Russia and China were allies, they were communist states, then they fought, now they're buddies. So I don't think we will be surprised by shifts within the thing. But my own sense is, I mean, India, of course, is stronger today. So I don't think we should worry too much whether the Americans can handle both. And I'll conclude with one thought. I mean, this is not that Americans are going to come and fight on the Himalayas, or what has changed in the US strategy to Indo-Pacific or to Europe is to get the allies to do more. What Trump administration said, look, these Europeans, they don't pay for the defense. I look at a different Germany, and Germany buys gas from Russia. That problem, of course, Democrats are far more civil, but the essential argument that Europe has to do more for its own defense, as opposed to Americans being the sole lifter of the weight. And similarly in Asia, what the US is doing is not that it wants to be the sole policeman, that it is building a network of alliances and using its partners to do more of the lifting. Take example of Japan. Japan has just decided to double its defense expenditure from $40 billion a year to $80 billion a year in the next 5 years. Now, if you think towards the end of this decade, a Japan that spends $80 billion every year as the third largest defense spender, the consequences of that are going to have an effect. So it's not just the US. US has strengthened its alliance with Japan. Japan is doing a lot more, unlike in the Cold War. Our Korean friends, they're doing a lot more things today. Australians, they're part of AUKUS. So I think it is about building partnerships and alliances rather than what the US does alone. And for India, which wants to be a power in its own right, it's an ideal situation. We can expand our profile. And if the Americans support us in that process, that's very welcome.
Thank you. Ashley, would you like to come in on the same question?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Shabani. And again, thanks, Carnegie India, for hosting this fantastic dialogue and tonight's event. I agree with a lot of what Raja said. A couple of points of difference. One, I think the question we're really asking is one about relative focus, not absolute focus. Of course, at some level, the US can and will continue to do things in Europe and Asia and the Middle East and Latin and the rest of the world. So we're talking about relative muscle movements here. And my concern is that, let's rewind to 2018. The 2018 National Defense Strategy and the defense policy work in the United States since then was focused on trying to wean the United States off of a two-theater mindset. Basically running the argument that the United States, in order to be able to have the wherewithal to deter and, if necessary, defeat a major peer competitor in high-intensity warfare, and most importantly, to prepare for that in order to sustain deterrence in either Europe or Asia, it really needed to double down on the most serious threat, and that threat was China. Now, the beginning of the Biden administration agreed with that statement. The Biden team wanted to basically maintain the policy settings of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. It took significant political flack to withdraw from Afghanistan in a very chaotic way, but in a way that strategically made sense. And I think states in Asia that are always looking for signs of US reassurance basically understood that withdrawal differently from the way that Europeans interpreted it as an effort by the United States to extract itself from a costly 2 decades long engagement in the Middle East and finally really reinvest in its strategic equities in Asia, be that posture, be that alliances, be that defense spending, be that presence. Unfortunately, when Ukraine reared its head, I think initially the United States did well to try and minimize its involvement, stay out of direct engagement with Russia, and play a sort of an offshore balancing role, to use a slightly inappropriate metaphor for a continental engagement. But what has happened since then is that they have been drawn in because the equities within the United States system in terms of focusing on European defense, US posture in Europe, the sanctity of European alliances, that Atlanticist outlook is a very, very strong pull on US strategic culture. And at the same time, the opportunity, the duty, the temptation to get involved in defending with significant indirect support, now to the tune of $50 billion in terms of what's been pledged, to defend Ukraine against Russia was too much to resist. Now, I'm not criticizing that sentiment. It is, of course, important that the United States plays a significant role in maintaining the norm against the conquest of sovereign territory and so forth. But what we've seen happen is the administration shift from its initial position to now argue that, in fact, the US not only can prosecute a two-front grand strategy, but in fact that it is a greater source of strength when they do so. And this is my concern, is that the way that these two theaters, Europe and Asia, have become viewed in Washington as a single theater has its concerns for countries in Asia that want to see a more dedicated US rebalance. Now, there are certainly areas in which the bringing together of a European and an Asian theatre when it comes to coordination amongst US alliances and partners has advantages. In the area of technology control, global governance, infrastructure financing and so forth, European countries that are increasingly concerned by China as well as by Russia have a lot to offer in the global competition between the United States and China, or really what we should talk about is the global competition between Russia and China on the one hand, and less, and rule-abiding nations on the other. But when it comes to America's strategic position in Asia, it doesn't necessarily follow that this two-front strategy will deepen and strengthen its position in Asia. And so I think here is where we are now. You've seen countries in Asia quite divided on the extent to which they see that they have a dog in the fight of the war in Ukraine. Countries, US allies like Japan, Korea, Australia, partners like Singapore have all been on board with international sanctions, have sent varying degrees of material or financial support for the Ukrainian resistance. It's been largely tokenistic, but it's been an important sign of the contribution these countries make to US alliances globally, to the international rules-based order and its defense. But on the other hand, you've had countries in Asia that have, wanted to stay out of hostilities on the one hand, to being outright critical of the way the West has managed and become engaged in a protracted conflict in the Middle East. And that spectrum runs from India to Laos, from Indonesia to Malaysia, in terms of the way that regional countries here have not sided with the way US allies in this region have taken a stand on Ukraine. What that means is the source of American strength, or the transformation of America's strategic position in Asia, which is moving from a unipolar one to a multilateral one, where allies and partners shoulder more of the burden, now has to deal with the fissures that exist in the partnerships in this part of the world. Now, those fissures are certainly manageable. Indeed, if the crisis in Ukraine does start to wrap up, if Russia is sort of terminally wounded and stands down, as I think many of us hope will be the case in the coming months, then in fact you will see the capacity for those fissures in Asian partnerships to start to close. But if that doesn't happen, and if the agenda of defense in Europe and the way that becomes increasingly bound up with an ideological, values-based strategy about promoting democracy, defending it, standing up against autocracy, takes on more and more of a characteristic of a defining feature of US strategy, then it just is going to make it that much harder for the United States, Australia, Japan, India to build coalitions in this part of the world. And it's coalitions that are ultimately going to be the source of strength in a regional competition vis-a-vis China, because as I think is recognized more or less universally now, that neither the United States nor Japan nor Australia, nor any of the countries of the Indo-Pacific are by themselves going to have the wherewithal to counterbalance, to stand up to Chinese power, ambition, influence in this region. And it's only by working together that we can galvanize that coalition. So we do need to be very mindful of the kind of diplomatic, geopolitical glue that keeps states together in this part of the world, and also mindful of what can melt that glue when it comes to the tenor and tone of engagements elsewhere.
So moving on with alliances, because both Raja sir and Ashley brought it up. Ms. Bagchi, I wanted to ask you about Quad. I was listening to a podcast of yours, but from a couple of years ago, where you said Quad 2.0, it was very wise that the 4 alliance partners had separate statements, so that they had room to maneuver and pursue their national interests instead of having a common joint statement. But in light of recent events, do you think it's time for these 4 the alliance to come together and make a statement that is coherent and joint?
Thank you, Shivani, and thank you, Carnegie. And I think this was a discussion that was waiting to happen. To answer your question, there has been a joint statement. There has been a movement since that particular podcast. That was some time back. There have been joint statements from the Quad countries. And if I had to sort of look at the Quad in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, my personal sense is the Quad has displayed resilience. And that is, I think that's important. They've displayed resilience not merely post-Ukraine, certainly post-COVID, during COVID. And I think if we have to ask the question of whether America can walk and chew gum, the fact that the Quad not only remains vibrant, it remains reasonably robust. The fact that it has cloned itself in another part of the world with another Quad tells you the power of the idea behind the Quad. And you can say that, oh, not only do you not have a joint statement, but what is it exactly that you all are doing together? It's still a little vague. Yes, all of which is correct. But I think we should look at Quad slightly differently. My sense is the Quad is an embodiment of the new trend in foreign policy and international politics, and that is technology. What you're seeing with the Quad and what you see with the elements of the Quad are rule-setting elements. these are, they may not, it's not just COVID vaccines. It is how do you set rules in place for a future world order. And that is where the Quad is. In all of this, what is the country, or rather the power, that we are all balancing against? And it is very clearly, it's very clear what it is. In the post-Ukraine, in a post-Ukraine situation, I would say Russia would be a little more dependent on China than it previously was. And I think Raj was right to look at the ups and downs of the Russia-China relationship. And I believe that some of that will remain. But there is another part of that particular relationship as well, and that is a dependence by Russia on China regarding elements of modern manufacturing, and that would be technology. Again, something that Russia really needs the West for its manufacturing, which it may now depend a little more on China. Whether that relationship is one of dependence or whether that relationship is one of contestation in future, the fact is we have to believe that that relationship will endure. If you just look at what is happening today, I mean, given the fact that Moscow is going to be selling energy to China in local currency, that reduces dependence on the dollar. China moving its investments out of the Western world. You are seeing a churn in progress. We have to function. We have to work with the idea that it might be a Russia-China axis that is deeper than we see today. And that has implications for Indian security. That has implications. And therefore, we do look at the Quad as actually one of the more important alliances that have come about in recent times.
I think the point about deeper Russia-China ties, along with what Ashley said of how Asian states now look at the US in terms of being a security provider. Mr. Gokhale, do you think that the perception of China in Asia has changed? Its BRI's partners maybe look at it differently, India's neighbors, possibly ASEAN members?
Yeah, so I think China had 20 years of good luck and good diplomacy, which is it was able to convince our whole region, the Indo-Pacific, that the US would provide security and that China would give people the material prosperity that was needed. But all this while, in those years, and I go back to 2003, 4, 5, when China started talking about the Malacca dilemma, it also started speaking about efforts by the United States to change the status quo in what they called Asia Pacific. And I'm talking of Chinese literature. If you read the People's Liberation Army Daily or the writings of the Beijing or China Institute for International Strategic Studies, you would see that as far back as 2005, there was this correlation between the Malacca dilemma and the US posture. And they subsequently built up the narrative that the United States was changing this arrangement, which was a very good arrangement for all of us in the region, where they provided the security and the Chinese provided jobs. Of course, we know this was not the case because quietly China was engaging in a massive program of naval modernization, which you see on ground today, but which began with the acquisition of the Varyag in 1998. Now, of course, in 2013, the whole philosophy of foreign policy of China changed. And as a result, you saw a more assertive posture some might even say aggressive posture by the Chinese side. And I think what we have seen in the last 10 years is a manifestation of that approach. And of course, this has changed perceptions that the region has about China. In some cases, it is stated, as in our case, for instance, but in some cases, it is unstated, as in the case of some of the ASEAN countries. But I think what is telling is that even before the developments in the South China Sea, when I was High Commissioner in Malaysia, and when the Malaysians were asked by our leadership as to why they were buying the Sukhoi MKM, which is a very advanced aircraft, who was the adversary? And they very clearly talked about who the adversary was. And when we asked them, but why don't you talk about it openly? They said, the Americans are withdrawing from the Indo-Pacific. The Japanese have plateaued. The Australians are not stepping up to the plate, and neither are you. So why should we unnecessarily make an enemy of the one country which is not only helping us economically, but which might prove to be a security problem if we call it a security problem? So I think the perception about China is very clear in the region. It's a question of who is willing to articulate it and who is not willing to articulate it. To the extent that the Americans pivot to the Indo-Pacific substantively, not talk, you will see a greater articulation. But I do want to add a note of caution to what Indrani said, and that is, if you look at Quad so far, I do agree that some good statements have been made. But on the recent so-called pillars, climate change, critical supply chains, infrastructure, trade, there are very few, if any, financial commitments by the United States or, for that matter, Japan and Australia. And therefore, let's wait to see who puts their money where their mouth is. And I think that's really important.
Thank you. I have a lot of follow-up questions, but Raja sir, if I can squeeze in one last question before you leave. I'd like to come to India. And in 2019, Russia, China, and South Africa had a joint naval exercise. I think it was November 2019. And at that time, you had written that this is the time for India to have a substantive dialogue with Russia to discuss how they can both collaborate in the Indian Ocean region. Would you say that that space is still open for India and Russia?
I think it was a conscious policy at the time that we must keep engaged because Russia was getting closer to China. And the question of what happens to our relationship, I mean, that issue is not sorted out. But I think the deeper question today is, look, Chinese Navy is going to come to the Indian Ocean. It's not a question of whether, but when, because the scale of the buildup will bring them here. Like all the other great trading nations over the last 500 years, they're going to come in too. The question is, how do we deal with it? Not, is it a good thing or a bad thing? But that's a reality that we have to deal with. In the past, we wanted to keep Russia on our side, but I'm not so sure today, given the closeness of the Russia-China relationship. But then, nothing is fixed. We've seen Stalin's Russia, we've seen Khrushchev's Russia, we've seen Brezhnev's Russia. And don't forget, within Russia itself, there is a strong westernizing influence, because there's been an alternation between Slavophiles and westernizers. So who knows, the post-Putin Russia might say, look, those of the diplomats here know, the Kozyrov era, when under Yeltsin, they loved America. They wouldn't pay attention to us. So I think the important thing is not to say, look, who do we side with? How do we build our leverage in the shifting great power relationship? Because they will shift. It's a matter of time and scale of time, rather than there is a fixed relationship. Just because they signed something on February 4th, if Russia weakens, how China treats it is going to be very different. So I think we should be open-ended, build strong ties with the West, while at the same time, hoping like hell, we can keep the Russians on our side, but it's getting harder. But my sense is, the question is, do we build our capabilities fast enough so that we don't lose out in a shifting balance of power between the major powers? I think with that, gentlemen, I'll seek your permission to...
Thank you so much. Ashley, we were talking about a substantive pivot to the Indo-Pacific by the US, and you have written about how the US policy towards the Indo-Pacific has failed when it comes to the economic domain. But with the announcement of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, do you think it's just a signal that is being sent to the region, or there is a bigger idea behind it?
A couple of points on US, the place of economics in US regional strategy. First, I think it has to be said, Australia, Japan, the other members of the CPTPP will resist to the end giving up hope and effort to expend on the Americans to bring them back into the CPTPP process. It is the high watermark for regional trade architecture. At the moment, the United States finds itself outside of any major regional trade grouping other than the one of its own very recent creation. It's sort of complementary to the TPP. IPEF is sort of complementary to the TPP. The door is clearly still open. And the politics of the United States, while gummed up oftentimes on Capitol Hill and while also gummed up at an elite level, broadly speaking, when you look at public opinion pollings, there is support in the United States still for a free trade agenda. So I don't think we should fundamentally close the door on that idea, even as it doesn't appear very likely in the short term. In terms of what IPEF is and how effective it will be and what signal it sends in Asia, I'd say the following. First is you've got to give the Biden administration points for trying. They know that the pathway towards achieving the TPP or the CPTPP is basically close to zero, certainly ahead of the midterms. And they haven't wanted to expend political capital to get there. They also understand that the source of influence, of Chinese influence in Asia and of US relative decline in the influence game is economic. It's not military. It's not diplomatic even. It's fundamentally economic. Southeast Asian countries, South Asian countries want investment. They want development opportunities. They want infrastructure financing and so on and so forth. The United States is in pursuing IPEF, trying to sort of thread the needle between what it is that their system is sort of able and willing to give and what it is that the region wants. So that is a positive dynamic. And I think supporters of the US in Asia, Australia, Japan, Singapore and others have been as supportive as they can be of the IPEF agenda, in part because something needs to catch on to start to begin to change perceptions that the US has exited regional economic statecraft. But how effective will it actually be in building the kind of influence or starting to recalibrate patterns of influence in Asia to advantage the US, those countries associated with the IPEF? It's hard to be optimistic. I sort of ungenerously characterize IPEF a little bit as that scene in Love Actually, I'm sure a movie that at least someone in this room must have seen, where the US president says to his British counterpart, I'll give you anything you want unless it's something I don't want to give. And so much of IPEF are those things which the United States is interested in. It's supply chain resilience, for example. It's technology-led, but they're not the things that regional countries mostly want. What do regional countries mostly want? Market access and investment. And those things are still not sort of front and center or even on the agenda of IPEF. And I think until that happens, it will be something that's better than nothing, but not something that's going to tilt the tide of what we, I think, all understand. And I think what most American strategists also understand is the fundamental vector of the change in patterns of alignment, and that's the economic one.
Do you want to come in?
Well, I think IPEF comes in because really on the ground, I don't see any resonance for something like CPTPP in the US. I think the kind of free trade agreements that we are comfortable with, that we are familiar with, my sense is they have run their course. And IPEF is, I think, looking for an identity or a different kind of way of an economic arrangement. I think it's easier for us to be much more skeptical and critical of IPEF because it doesn't measure up to any of the benchmarks that we know and that we have been with. But I think there is something there because supply chain resilience, the way we are trying to craft it, is actually a little different from the way we've had supply chains function in the past, which was overwhelmingly dependent on a country, looked for the cheapest route, often a very long route. But I think COVID changed the way we think about a lot of these things. Certainly in India, and I dare say even in the US, that your supply chains are essentially, if you have to build a resilient supply chains, they militate against the kind of market access arrangements that you had in the past, because it is much more of a working with rather than through, and I think that's I'd say that it's early days yet with IPEF, but I would not diss IPEF. I think it has a future because the reality in the world is very different today than it was when we were. I mean, look at why we walked out of RCEP. I don't think America has not just the political will to, but I don't think it can actually match up to China if it actually goes back to CPTPP. So I think that's.
Thank you. I think most recently, India has accepted 3 of the 4 sort of founding conditions of
So I think that's the flexibility of IPEF, or rather the fluidity of the system, is what attracts trade-resistant countries like India. We are not a very trade-friendly nation. So.
Considering we're having this discussion on the eve of a SCO summit, Mr. Gokhale, I would really like to know your views on India taking the presidency of the SCO and what that would mean in terms of opportunities to rival China in the Central Asian region.
My gosh, that's really taking it in a completely different direction I was not prepared for, frankly. Look, the fact is that in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we do have different position from the others on many, many issues. Whatever may have been the reasons for our seeking to join in 2007 or 2008 when we gave our formal application, or perhaps even earlier, the circumstances had changed by 2017 when we got in. So we are dealing with a very different situation in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization today than we would have anticipated earlier. And with the membership of Iran this year, I think that situation will be further complicated because Iran is aligned on certain issues. There is, I think, an expectation that the organization is becoming, for want of a better word, anti-West. And that is not something that I believe, forget the government of India, I don't think Indian society also shares the view that you join an organization just because it is anti-something. I presume we are joining all these institutions to get something and not simply as an anti-West. So it's going to be a struggle for us. But I think the plus side is that it offers us an institutional mechanism to talk to Central Asian republics, with which we not only have a historical relationship, but which is a current necessity on many fronts. Of course, there's the economic front. If the North-South, international North-South corridor gets going with Russia, then there will be trade through Iran, the Chabahar port. but also on political issues, on issues of stability in Central Asia, on the issue of fundamentalism in Central Asia. There are a number of common things we have with Central Asian countries, and SCO offers us the opportunity to interact with them, even though we have one country in the middle which doesn't allow us transit rights. That having been said, I think it is going to be a challenge to be a member of the SCO. And obviously the presidency is a prestigious sort of role, and I'm sure that people in the government are thinking of how to use it to strengthen our case on a number of these issues. So I think we should look at it as a positive opportunity in that regard, and we should minimize the possibility of us being used by others simply to knock the West. I don't think that's in our interest.
Thank you, and I'm sorry if I put you on the spot with that one. With that, I'd like to turn to the audience. If anyone has a question, could you please identify yourself and, yeah.
Good evening. I'm the Danish ambassador. I've served here in 9 years almost, and luckily or unluckily, I would say another 2 years. What I would like to bring to your attention is the European aspect. In Europe, we have been too naive for too long time about the role of China. We see yet that the whole power is moving economically, security policy-wise towards Asia. In this very good panel, you're discussing about the closeness of Russia and China and all that. Our perspective will rather be, how do we secure that India stands up to its own opportunities, its own objectives? So rather navigating in that very dangerous water of China, Russia coming closer and so forth. And I don't believe now Russia has left, but I don't believe his analysis that is ups and downs. I think we see a very different context now. So my question to all of you is, how do we secure that India is defining its own interest and is not just trying to navigate between Russia, China, and that context? Europe wants a very strong India based on its own interest and definition of that. Where are you in that?
Would either of you like to take that?
Maybe I can just sort of kick off the discussion. I mean, I think it's quite clear that India is acting in its own interest when it comes to the current conflict. And that interest is for an elected government to meet the requirements of the electorate, which in this case is economic development. So I think there's no doubt that India is not acting in a manner which either in a certain sense serves the interests of the West or serves the interests of Russia. But I think we also need to bear in mind that if India is to economically develop, is as a counterweight, and I don't mean in the military sense, I mean in the economic sense, then Europeans have to adjust their view of India as well. And I think that while in the capitals, let's say Berlin, there may be a certain view, there is a very different view in Frankfurt, in Stuttgart, and in Munich, and that's where business resides. And if you go to China today and you see the economic benefit that German business is making, even today with all the problems, then there is a disconnect between what the European governments say and what European business does. And to the extent that Europe, which is 30% of the world's economy, or close to at least a quarter, to the extent that they do not diversify the supply chains and come to other countries which have surplus labor, which have technology, which have the skills, I think it will just remain in the realm of discussion when Europe says, you know, India has to pursue its national interest, because we will have to secure that capital from other countries or from whatever we then see is in our interest. And therefore, the main point I'm saying is, I think Europeans need to reorient their policy to what are facts on the ground. On the ground, European business is not leaving China. They may not be investing more, but they're not leaving China. It's still a huge economy. And therefore, I think that needs to be factored into the whole European approach to India as well.
Hi, I have a question to Ms. Bagchi as well as Ambassador Gokhale.
Sorry,
I'm Rityusha from Delhi University. So the first question is to Ms. Bagchi. In case you see a greater convergence between China and Russia, how do you see the impact on India? What do you see as India's next step in that case? Because as was suggested by another panelist. And to Mr. Gokhale, do you see a Quad centrality in Asia Pacific emerging anytime soon? And is it just a question of bringing in the money and whether that can kind of materialize with more countries in Asia Pacific joining the fray? Thank you.
Thank you. To your question about the implications for India, in a deeper alliance between China and Russia, we see that happening. The implications for India is immense, I would say, given the fact that we have a dependence on Russia for our defense equipment, given the fact that we still continue to import a large amount from China. And I would say the implications for us would be huge in the security realm. We would have to worry about where Russia stands on India's security interests. We know very well where China stands on India's security interests, but we would have to question this of Russia all the time, and that would inevitably dilute that relationship. It would inevitably lead to India diversifying, as it has been over the past decade, but that diversification will only accelerate. And I personally think that is happening, and it will continue to happen. That diversification will have to happen. There's no other option.
On the Quad issue, I think it is already central to the region. And the fact that China has gone from saying it is like sea foam which will disappear overnight to now saying that it is an Asian NATO which is going to make everybody's life miserable, that shift itself indicates the mind space that Quad has captured in the region. I think the issue for us, and I'm sure the government is well aware of it, is conscious of it, is that whereas the other three members of Quad have they're treaty allies, we don't have a treaty alliance with any of the other three. So our position in Quad is a little different from the other three who, under treaties, have to come to each other's mutual defense. And we have to take this into account in evolving the institution of Quad. That's one point. The second point is there are other players in the region which we need to be mindful of in terms of convincing them that Quad is not simply an anti-China containment strategy. And that includes ASEAN, which is a very significant player in the region, economically for India as well as politically. As far as we are concerned, the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific has South Asian countries, it has the Gulf, it has East Africa. We have to convince all of them that this is not just a strategy to counter China. And therefore, I think what is important is to disabuse these countries of what China is trying to do by confusing them, which is fusing the idea of the Indo-Pacific with Quad. These are two completely separate ideas. The Indo-Pacific is India's vision of what we want to achieve in the next 20 years, because we have, for the last 2,000 years before the British came, been a maritime power. The Quad is a platform. It is a platform just like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and China. I mean, are we to consider that a threat? These are four countries in our neighborhood. We don't go on saying this is a Quad, some kind of a Chinese security alliance against us. And similarly, if India, Australia, Japan, and the United States have some common interests, there should be no reason for them to say it is a security alliance against them, much less to confuse it with Indo-Pacific. So I think that the centrality of Quad is very much there. Some convincing has to be done by us that this has nothing to do with containing China. We have a lot of other interests, including with ASEAN, East Africa, and the Gulf.
On the Quad, a couple of points. One, the Quad will not be the central, multilateral entity in the Indo-Pacific simply because there are so many others. And what you're seeing is a region that will be defined, a multipolar region that will be defined by a proliferation of alignment dynamics, of bilateral, of trilateral, of plurilateral agreements. They will all be functionally oriented. They will sometimes overlap. They will sometimes diverge. It will be messy, but that will be the future. Second, and to disagree slightly, Ambassador Gokhale, on your framing of the Quad, I think that it is going to be near impossible to convince the region in an intrinsic sense that the Quad has nothing to do with China, because I think that by bringing together the three most powerful countries in Asia and Australia, I think, and Australia being a country that is seeking to play an outsized role and doing so from a position, I would add, of relative geopolitical comfort, compared to the other three that all have direct or more direct sort of frontline engagements with China. It is sending a signal that these most powerful countries, and in some senses most committed countries to the maintenance or the careful evolution of the regional order, will do so in ways that are going to be additive to the existing lineup of institutions, and will also be providing public goods that cross from the non-security domain through to the security domain. And I think the Quad has been very smart and careful in its messaging of the elements of public security goods that pertain to the security domain at one step removed, space, maritime domain awareness, etc., in order to slowly bring the region around to that view. And I would also add that I think that this is an agenda that carefully needs to be advanced, because first, many countries in Southeast Asia, and I think Beijing certainly, has priced in the fact that the Quad is going to be operating on the basis of a collective arrangement that has the constraining, not the containing, but the constraining and the shaping of rules around Chinese power at its heart. And two is, frankly, if it's not the Quad, then which group of countries is going to take the leading role on building out and building away from a purely hub and spokes model of US alliances to one that brings in major contributions of regional powers. So the Quad, other trilaterals that include India, Indonesia, and so forth, are sort of integral to this process. And I think as we see the Quad agenda continue to unfold, as well as we see the sort of bilateral spokes within the Quad continue to strengthen, take the Australia-India bilateral, for example, which is absolutely got a maritime focus as well, and absolutely has a maritime focus where both of our national interests, security and otherwise, are animated fundamentally in the Northwest and the Northeast Indian Ocean. This is going to be something which I think will be a positive contributor to regional security as well.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, if we look back during the last 100 years, most conflicts that the world has seen have been centered around the West. And invariably, these conflicts have been cast into binaries. And so the outcome was always victory and defeat. And now we are also seeing the crisis in Ukraine being cast into a binary between democracy and autocracy. That's one of the reasons why the conflict continues, and we can't really predict about how it will come to an end. And so let me come to the Indo-Pacific. The US-China rivalry, at least in the US, to a fairly great extent, is also being cast into a binary, increasingly. So what does that do to the potential of the US-China rivalry playing out in Indo-Pacific for countries of the Indo-Pacific, say specifically India?
I have 2 points to make on that. We seem to focus on the US, but in China, for many years, Chinese writings have described the United States as the existential threat. So there is not on one side, but on both sides, the view that the other represents an existential challenge. And therefore, I think responsibility must rest on both and not on the United States. Second point is, we assume that the whole idea of that rivalry, the word decoupling, emerged after President Trump took office. But we conveniently forget that long before Trump was a twinkle in any American electorate's eye, you had another leader across the Pacific who was building the Belt and Road, which is an alternative trading hub, who was building Paitu, which is an alternative GPS, who was building an alternative internet, so you didn't have to use Google, Instagram, and Twitter, who was building an alternative international multilateral banking system through the AIIB and the NDB, so you didn't have to go to the Bretton Woods institutions, who was building a 5G network, so you didn't have to use Western technology, who was decoupling. We just tend to think that Trump began the decoupling. I don't think so. It is Xi Jinping who consciously began that decoupling. So I think responsibility for what is now emerging as a bipolar problem is the fault, or the responsibility is on both sides. And I think it is so deeply entrenched in both that despite all our wishful thinking that eventually there will be a modus vivendi, and there might be at some level, I think that this is now a strategic problem for all of us to deal with.
There was a, sorry, did you want to come in?
I was just going to add, I mean, I fully agree with the way you characterize it. I would add as well 2 points. One, the US-China rivalry exists as a bilateral entity, but it also, and most importantly, exists as a multilateral entity in Asia. And I think that oftentimes, we get siloed into thinking that US-China rivalry is trashing the regional order, when in fact, it's actually a combination of China's rise in ambitions, America's relative decline, and strategy of preserving its position in Asia that has taken on a multilateral dynamic in Asia. And so I don't think we can understand or manage those dynamics if we think about them purely as bilateral. Secondly, when it comes to what countries should how they should understand the framing of this rivalry as ideological. Again, as I said in my opening comments, I think it's a very unhelpful framing to cast China, in the United States that is, very unhelpful framing to cast China as one side of a democracy versus autocracy binary, in large part because it turns off the rest of the region. It makes US strategy about something ideological that regional countries, for their own interests, if not perceptions, can't and won't and don't want to be a part of. So it makes coalition building more difficult. And I think we see this in particular in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, I think to understand it from Washington's perspective, if you are trying to make the business case on Capitol Hill and annual budget cycles for why and how to fund this thing called Indo-Pacific strategy, that is the pathway of greatest, the most lucrative pathway. And so I think for that reason, if not for the internal sort of views in Washington about the intrinsic competition between two systems that exists, I think we're not going to see that framing go away. And so what countries in the region that are concerned about that framing but want to play a productive role in managing US-China rivalry, managing the multilateral rivalry that exists, we need to, I think, bend and redefine what it means for us in Asia to have this competition playing out. And I think that countries like Japan, like Australia, like India, like Singapore, have all contributed significantly to this already, and I think it's in all of our interests.
Since we're nearing the end of the session, I thought we could collect a few questions. Yeah, I think there's a question on my left. Adyasha here. Several questions. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. Martine from the Norwegian Embassy. I'm very curious, if you were to advise Prime Minister Modi about his message in the coming days as he's meeting with Prime Minister Putin, what would be your advice? And also, how do you interpret his space of maneuver? What is the room to communicate to Putin on the topic that we are discussing tonight? Thank you.
We'll collect a few, yeah, and sure. Yeah. General Shukla, you had a question?
So I just wanted to, it's a comment and a question built into it. And this is this new power calculus, the power calculus of China, which is reflected through the sensibilities of at least sections of the Chinese elite. And the set of arguments run something like this. They say that there's enough wealth now. China has made enough wealth. The time has come to convert this wealth into powerhood. And they say Mao gave us the revolution, Deng gave us wealth, Xi will restore greatness. So this new dynamic, and they say hide and bide had a shelf life, it had to end, now the time has come to go loud and proud. So this change in the way they look at power, along with the various metrics of the instrument of force which we were discussing this morning, 6 aircraft carrier Navy, 460 ships, and so on and so forth. When they combine, this ideological shift or whatever you call it, along with the way they have nursed the instrument of force. The Americans concede that the PLA today is a peer competitor in the Western Pacific and a challenger around the globe. My question now is this, that has the time come to simply square up to this hardball? You cannot tiptoe around this reality, and we just have to match up power to power. There are no halfway houses. Is this deduction or is this inference right in the panel?
All right. At the end of the room, there were many hands up. Yeah.
Thank you. Chris Holder-Ross from the British High Commission. A question to the panel as a whole. To what extent will the convergence of Russia and China, and also the economic decoupling of the US and China that's been described, test India's abstention from treaty alliances in the longer term? Thank you.
And I think, Ambassador, the last one.
I've completely forgotten what the questions were.
Thank you very much. I think Mrs. Bagchi, Bagchi, how do you
Just
call
call me Indrani.
Indrani, Madam Indrani, you touched very important issue actually, and that is linked with the Indian, European, Western cooperation and the tightness of our relations. Is this resilience of supply chains. And I would argue that you see it at the moment that the companies, European companies also are looking really the risk and resilience in China at the moment. They won't go there probably out, but they are looking, they are not anymore investing. And that is already a huge thing. Where do they invest? They are now looking resilience and sharing. We haven't discussed so much about the sharing in the sort of similar value-based. And what I hear now actually very much is that the companies are looking also areas where countries are sharing the same values in the sustainability, in some other areas as well. European Union is India's one of the biggest trading partner, biggest investor in India. I think this is really a momentum for India and Europe to find each other. We have a situation, and the question is actually, when India is balancing and trusting that Russia is the balancing factor vis-a-vis, for instance, China, what happens when Russia is so weak that nobody can foresee, but unfortunately, there is probably only one way at the moment of Russia's future, and it is very much weaker Russia than ever before. So how does that impact on this kind of balancing thinking?
To your question about Prime Minister Modi meeting President Putin, I think the way I see it, you might call it a challenge, but the way we look at the Russia relationship is how do we manage a declining relationship. This is a declining relationship and has been. It's still a close relationship. There are legacy issues, and but the kind of relationship we had, say, a decade ago, is probably not the kind of relationship we have today, and probably will not be the kind of relationship that we can foresee in the future. That does not mean that Mr. Modi is going to chastise President Putin in a way that we have not done before. I think the Indian position on cessation of hostilities and going back to diplomacy and dialogue will remain, and that will probably be the central point of his message to President Putin. I think they will reaffirm the relationship. It's not a minor relationship. It's a major relationship and has a long history, and we hope it has a future. But looking at the way Russia has conducted itself, we would be a little skeptical. But yes, that's where I would put it. Chris, can you tell me a question once more about the
question was broadly, will the convergence of Russia and China, as we've seen recently, and also the general trend towards economic decoupling that Ambassador Gokhale described, will that test India's traditional abstention from alliances in the longer term?
Well, see, I mean, India doesn't do alliances in the traditional sense. I mean, as Mr. Gokhale pointed out, even in the Quad, we are the only ones to not have a treaty alliance with any of the other three. We don't have a treaty alliance with Russia either. But I think it will test a lot of the relationships, or it will just test a lot of the assumptions that we have currently about our relationships. And it will make, we will have to navigate these waters. These waters are uncharted waters, and these are tough times, because the implications of several things, the implications of the war, the implications of China's rise, the implications of Russia's greater dependence on China, and the implications of the US-China rivalry, all are significant where India is concerned. So for India to have to be able to secure its interests in a way without actually sort of whistling its values down the river is going to be difficult. And it's an uphill task. And I think everybody in this business has been on that one job of being able to navigate that particular ship. On resilient supply chains in Europe being in, frankly, it's up to Europe to make that call. When India and China were in a conflict in Galwan in 2020, Europe was actually negotiating a CAI with China. So I think that's something for Europe to take a much more. We were in Berlin in 2017, just after Doklam. A group of us journalists were there, and we were questioned by the German Foreign Office why China was seen to be a strategic challenge, and why was BRI? Why did India oppose the BRI forum in May that year? And I think our answer was just look at the map. And where do you think the BRI is going to end up? But it just that naivete at that point. I mean, there may be a reality check today because of Russia, but honestly, we would like to see the reality check vis-a-vis China. I think there are ways that they can invest in India, we won't go there. But I think that's a strategic decision for both businesses and governments in Europe to take, because it's not merely, the way I look at it, it's not merely values-based, because if values were the reason, they would be investing more in India and not in China, because in values, Chinese values and European values have been at war for a long, long time. So I don't think it's values that is important. I think it's a question of trust. And I think that is something that has come up a lot more lately, certainly post-COVID and post the war, whether those trusted relationships can become business relationships. I think we'll just have to wait and see.
Mr. Gokhale, would you like to? Okay. Any closing thoughts? Closing thoughts as we wrap up.
I think that, okay. I just wanted to address one point which our colleague from the UK had asked, and that is, I think the panelist who left wrote an article that non-alignment is dead. And I think the point he was making is that there are alignments. An alignment and an alliance are two different things. We need to understand. India is not an ally in the traditional sense that the United States or Australia or Japan think of an ally. That doesn't prevent us from being aligned on certain issues. And I think it's quite clear that India has aligned on certain issues with the US, with the West, and on other issues with others where it serves our national interest. And if Ukraine is to be looked at, I think on principle, our position is exactly the same as Europe's in terms of sovereignty, territorial integrity, going back to negotiations and so on. But then there is also the question of energy. And there is an impact of the war on India as well. It's not just on Europe. You've had in 2017, India being told don't import from Venezuela. We had $6 billion of investment there in oil assets. It wasn't that Venezuela was affecting India's security. We took that on the chin. In 2018, unilaterally, we were told you are importing 28 million tons of oil from Iran, stop it overnight. The Iranians weren't doing anything for us, nor were we consulted on the JCPOA or the abrogation of the JCPOA. We took that on the chin. I mean, to what extent are we to take others' problems on our chin when we are told time and again, you won't buy energy from A, B, C, and D? At some point, the Prime Minister has to decide whether the electorate is important or international opinion is important. And I think he did the absolute right thing by saying we fully respect the European security concerns, but we have our own, and those are energy security. And this is a case where, unfortunately, national interest must come over international interest. So I think it is important for the Europeans to understand that there are certain sensitivities in India on the Ukraine conflict as well, and that while obviously we are not impacted the way Europe is, we are still impacted. And the government has to do what it has to minimize that impact. Having said that, I think our own position on Ukraine is very clear to the Russians and to the Ukrainians and to anybody else who wishes to know, including China. I'll leave it at that. I mean, Ashley, maybe on the Quad and others, you can do the...
Look, very briefly, I think we're at time. Number one, I think it's hard. It's going to get increasingly difficult for all countries in the Indo-Pacific to secure their interests in any domain by themselves. So yes, I think that the time for non-alignment, not as a national doctrine of defense strategy, but as a principle of how you navigate your way in the international system, is clearly over. But alignments won't be fixed, and multipolar systems are characterized by often rapidly changing and overlapping systems of alignment. They evolve, they're often volatile, but in the Indo-Pacific, one thing is clear, and that is if we do have shared interests when it comes to the regional balance of power, to the regional balance of influence, these, even for a country like India, won't be secured by themselves. General Shilpa, your comment about your quick tour of China's military rise and ambitions now in Asia, and I think your question, rhetorical question being, isn't the time now to size up both sides when it comes to China's military rise, is instructive. If we look at the meteoric rise of the Chinese military, which may have slowed slightly, but is absolutely continuing at a pace faster than the rest of the whole Quad put together. We are, not able to address this challenge even within the Quad alone. I mean, access to other parts of the Indo-Pacific will hinge on the sovereign decisions of countries in Southeast Asia that we haven't really even discussed much this evening. So when it comes to China's rise, I think it's very clear that in the military domain, in the domain of geoeconomics, we are going to need to still address a lot of these challenges collectively. And finally, and I think going back to one of the earlier points here about India and isn't it in everyone's interest to have a strong India? Absolutely. But I think in order to get external countries to just focus on strengthening India, and in order to get all countries to realize that they can't solve their collective action problems alone, we need to settle for something that is a lot less than perfect. A bipolar international system, the world as it was up until, the international financial crisis may well have been one where we could have, all of us, hoped for top shelf solutions to all of the problems that we faced. But the pace of change, the pace of the challenges that we're facing, the volatility in the system, the need for friends and unusual partners on a whole range of issues means that we have to actually ditch that mindset. And we have to settle for partnerships with countries that don't share our values, for information sharing agreements with countries that are not as rock solid intelligence partners as we might once have had, for defense industrial partnerships with countries and technology transfer arrangements that are in fact disadvantageous to our own firms, but advantageous to our strategic interests. And until we sort of ditch that mindset that we can continue to run the world as if the perfect is possible, we're going to fall short.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but please feel free to chat with the panelists over dinner. Thank you so much, all of you, for spending this evening with us, and thank you to the audience as well. Please join us for dinner.